Welcome back to session number 2. I am Ana Lamo, a research economist at the European Central Bank and co-organizer of this conference. Session 2 today is about gender in economics. It's entitled Diversity and Inclusion in Economics and Good Practice. So it's very close to our heart for most of us. The first speaker is going to be online, virtual, and it's Maria Guadalupe from INSET, presenting the paper Retaining Talent in Organizations, Masculinity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Norms. Maria Guadalupe, the floor is yours.
Can you see me? Yeah?
Yep. And the slides?
Okay, let me know when to start.
Okay.
The slides should be up on the screen.
So you have 20 minutes. Now the question is, how do I warn you of 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left? I won't do it because you don't see me, do you?
No, I don't see you, but I do have a timer on, so I'll try and stay for that, if that helps.
Okay, if I see you are over the time, I shout. Yeah.
You can just cut me through, no worries. Okay.
Oh, you see the chat.
Okay, so if that's all good, I'll get started. I can actually see you on the corner of the screen. So thank you very much for having us today. The research I'm presenting is very much a work in progress with Maria Guadalupe, who should be online as well, and Kaiser Snellman. And what we're discussing today is the implication of masculinity and inclusion norms on the retention of talent in organizations. So the context in which our research emerges is with the lower proportion of female within faculty occupations in areas of economics, finance, business, management, etc. And across these fields of research, the observation that the higher up you look in terms of career rankings, the lower the proportion of women, which is typically being described as the leaky pipeline. And we review substantial evidence on the different factors that either contribute to or cause the leaky pipeline. But the major insight that we provide in this paper is focusing on those factors which relate to the norms and the culture, the norms of behavior that might be specific to academia. So academia is a historically male-dominated environment, which means that the norms that individuals are expected to display in order to be considered as successful or are ideal workers are stereotypically male. And this can look like being excessively aggressive, putting work over family, displaying ruthless competition. And although they're gender neutral in their formulation, women do not conform to the same extent to this normative stereotype of behavior, and hence feel treated less well or differently within their occupations. So how can this materialize? Women feel less valued for equal work contributions in research. Women have a lower probability of being published and subsequently cited. But these masculine norms of behavior may take on even more overt forms against women, such as we see evidence of women being asked more patronizing, sexist, and even hostile questions in different areas of research, such as seminars, the classroom, forums, etc. So putting together, what we first observe is that these masculine norms of behavior in academia tend to make women feel less included in their occupations and potentially explain why they seek careers elsewhere. There's another important element of context that makes our paper arguably this timely, is the observation that these institutions, economic environments, have been putting in place increasing efforts to improve the position of women. So this can materialize in different ways. And one long-standing objective is increasing gender equality, meaning the representation of women within economic occupations in academia. So for example, you can think of recruitment, promotion quotas, hiring quotas, etc. But in recognizing that increasing the number of women in the workplace, you don't necessarily promote their sense of inclusion and belonging, we review new evidence on initiatives that fall under the DEI banner, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, as is a testimony of this conference. So these initiatives take on different forms as well. It can be implicit bias trainings, it can be multiplying the number of case studies that feature female representatives, etc. But what's the tension that we're tapping into this paper is the fact that such initiatives to date provide mixed results. So some of the evidence suggests that they have no impact at all on promoting the position of women, and some suggest that they may even have trade-offs. What we mean by trade-offs, which is a notion that's going to come back quite frequently in the presentation, is that by changing the perceptions of one group, you're necessarily going to have negative repercussions on the other group. And so initially what we think of is groups in terms of gender, so gender groups. What could this look like for women? In their current formulation, these initiatives of equality, of inclusion, are so much formulated along gender lines that they actually reinforce gender bias between groups and conflicts between them. And in parallel, there's a lot of evidence that show that none of them target the pervasive masculine norms that we're actually trying to evaluate. And overarching is the concern of gender fatigue, whereby such initiatives of inclusion and equality more often impart on women, so women know that they will be responsible of initiating and implementing such initiatives, hence gender fatigue. But there are also potential trade-offs that we anticipate when looking at the other gender group, which is men. And generally, it's a sense of resentment or backlash in that the way in which opportunities are allocated in the institution are generated, or there's the assumption that they're generated because of a person's gender and not because of their contribution to the workplace. And so a sense of unfairness upon perceiving these changes to the workplace. And generally speaking, Brown et al. Describe this as the fixed pie bias, whereby resources in any institution are fixed, such that by promoting the outcome of one group, you're necessarily taking away from another group. And so what's interesting in this context is that we think there's coexisting norms of masculinity, but also inclusion and equality that might be contributing to gender dynamics in these academic occupations. And so what we do in this paper specifically is address these questions. So first and foremost, do men and women have different perceptions of masculinity, inclusion, and equality norms in their work environment? Subsequently, do these perceptions, i.e. of masculinity, inclusion, and equality, relate to individuals' sense of well-being and intentions to leave? And again, is this different between men and women? And overarching, are there trade-offs for men to making workplace norms friendlier to women? And friendlier to women, what we think in this context is less masculine and more inclusive. So to address these questions, the rest of the presentation and our paper is as follows. We describe the data and methods, then specify the framework and exactly what questions we're able to assess. And as a follow-up, I'll describe some of our initial findings and open up to discussion. So the data that we have for this paper is very novel data. It was collected as part of an EU-funded project that brings together 6 academic institutions in areas of economics, business, and management in 6 different European countries. What we did at the end of 2020 is we distributed a survey across these institutions that include validated scales of these workplace perceptions, of turnover intentions, of workplace well-being, a rich set of control variables that emerge in the literature as important to take into consideration, such as a person's household status, their position within the institution. But another really novel aspect of our research is that this survey is also distributed to staff members within the institutions. And this is important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it allows us to sort of disentangle what could be the behavioral norms that are specific to academia as an occupational group, which we'll be calling faculty, and what could be generalizable to academic institutions as a whole, which would include staff. And why this is so important in relation to measuring behavioral norms is that these 2 occupational groups have widely different gender distributions across the 6 institutions. So on one hand, you've got staff respondents who are in majority female, and on the other, faculty respondents who are in majority male. And this is reflected in the table that you have that describes our sample, where we've got just over 1,000 observations, of which 30% are faculty and 70% are staff, 32% are male, and 67% are female. And in the annexes, we have the response rate across these 4 different groups, alongside more descriptive statistics. But importantly, using this survey method, we want to spend a bit of time in suggesting what we're actually able to identify, perhaps by starting to say what we can't identify, which are causal relations. So what we're going to be presenting are correlations that are conditional on these set of individual controls, on institutional and department fixed effects, where we try to tease out the variation that could be due to each institution's individual characteristics and not to these intangible norms in academia. But even conditional on the set of parameters, we do explicitly address some other limitations that we anticipate when using survey data. One of them is common method variance or common method bias. Common method variance, in very general terms, is the variance that we would want to attribute to the measurement method in itself, so survey, and not the variance that is attributable to the constructs that we're trying to measure. And basically, you have common method bias when over 40% of your total variance is explained by a single factor that represents the survey. And so we implement a Harman test to ensure that we fall well below this threshold. And through this factor analysis, what we're also able to ensure is that these items that we included in our survey vary uniquely with these theoretical constructs that we want to tap into through the survey. There's another limitation that we anticipate, which is sample selection that could be on a broader scale selection into the workplace, but here selection into the survey. And what we do is to ensure robustness of all of our results, we implement Oster's bounding methodology that was developed in 2019. Basically, what this methodology does is it produces a bound that captures the sensitivity of the estimates to the inclusion of observable variables, so in our case, the individual controls, the fixed effects, etc., to generate information on their likely sensitivity to unobservable or omitted variables. Basically, what the bound does is if it excludes 0, we can then say with some confidence that should we have information on the entire population, it's likely that the relations we're estimating would also exclude 0. And so this means that the results we present subsequently are somewhat robust to sample selection, but since we look at different genders and occupations, what we also do, and these results are in the annexes, is we produce these bounds, disaggregating the sample by gender and occupation to account for potentially different selection mechanisms across these groups. So with these limitations or constraints in mind, this is basically the framework that we explore. We look at how perceptions correlate with intentions or utility. Broadly speaking, I'll describe them in a bit more depth, but outcomes that we think are important to organizations in economics, but also in broader areas of research. And what we were forefronting in the introduction slide is 3 different dimensions of organizations that we think are important to measure. So first and foremost, we've got masculinity contest culture, which is a scale that was developed by Colloque et al. And that typically tries to measure these overtly masculine behaviors, such as being ruthlessly competitive, putting work over family, etc. In parallel, we measure individuals' perceptions of support to gender equality and to inclusion. And this notion of inclusion was discussed in the introduction to this conference. Nishi also describes the conceptual difference between inclusion and equality, where inclusion here, what we're measuring is individuals' sense that they are part of formal and informal decision-making processes in their institution, regardless of socio-demographic belonging. So gender equality is very much based on belonging or not to a gender group. Inclusion is inclusion at large, so regardless of these different characteristics. In parallel, we measure turnover intentions and workplace well-being. So turnover intention in our survey is how likely a person would want to leave their institution, and it's quite a widely used measure in organizational research. But we acknowledge some limitations of this measure in that there are actual barriers to turnover that we can't really measure. And also turnover intentions don't really tell you what are behind these intentions. So is it a great promotion opportunity elsewhere? Is it pervasive masculine norms, for example? So in parallel to this, we measure workplace well-being using Bartels et al. And because we lack this last part of the framework, which goes from these important intentions to behaviors, what we do in our paper is extract correlation coefficients in different meta-analyses that suggest what would be the relation between intentions and actual turnover and well-being and actual turnover, so that we get a sense of the implications for organizations. So using this framework, this is the first part of the results that we discuss relates to individuals' perception of the workplace. So the way in which this table is structured is the 3 perceptive measures are dependent variables in this table, which we regress on a female dummy, a faculty dummy, and an interaction between the 2. And although in the first columns, we also include the controls and the fixed effects, although in the first columns, these parameters are entered in isolation, let's focus, or I'll draw your attention to the column 7 to 9, where they're entered in combination, just for the sake of time. What we find in terms of focusing on the differences between men and women is what we could have expected given the literature that we review. What do we mean by this? Women have consistently worse perceptions of their workplace relative to men. So this materializes as a lower sense of inclusion, of equality, and a higher sense of masculinity. But this other result, when you focus on faculty respondents, or the difference between staff and faculty, somewhat confirms that it was important for us to survey staff as well. When you look at the significant differences between staff and faculty, and this materializes as faculty having worse perceptions of their workplace environments. And if you take the case of inclusion, the differences are larger by occupation than by gender. So faculty members have 30% of a standard deviation lower sense of inclusion, whereas this is 17% on the differences between men and women. There's another important result in this table, which is when we have a look at the interaction between the female dummy and the faculty dummy. So already from this table, we know that women have worse perceptions, as do faculty. But in the perception of masculinity, there's something specific to academia, whereby female faculty have worse perceptions of masculinity that isn't explained in isolation by their occupation or their gender, but more by a multiplicative effect. So here there's something specific in the academic norms that we're tapping into. From here, the second set of results is looking at the correlation between these perceptions that we've just described and the intentions. So the main dependent variable in this table is now turnover intentions, which we regress again on the female dummy, the faculty dummy, and our 3 standardized perceptive measures. We introduce the controls and the different fixed effects. And again, here there's a lot that we could unpack, and perhaps we can do so during the discussion. But there's a few results that we highlight in this table. In particular, when you look on columns 3 to 5, where the 3 perceptive measures are entered independently in predicting turnover intentions, and they kind of react in the way that we would have expected them to. So inclusion and equality decrease your turnover intentions, whereas masculinity has the opposite effects. This is somewhat different when we add them in combination, which is column 7. Where the positive contribution that the support to gender equality had on reducing turnover intentions is almost entirely explained away by either its positive contribution to a sense of inclusion or by decreasing individuals' perceptions of masculinity. The results are a little bit different when we take workplace well-being as the main dependent variable, which, since this is survey measures, is quite reassuring. One similarity, that said, is when you take columns 3 to 5, again, these perceptive measures are strongly predictive of workplace well-being, again, in the direction that we could have expected. So a positive contribution of inclusion and of equality and masculinity as reducing individuals' well-being. One difference being that when we account for them in combination, knowing that they're probably correlated in individuals' minds, the contribution of gender equality is still significant. So increasing gender equality by 1 standard deviation increases workplace well-being by 7% of a standard deviation, which wasn't the case in turnover intentions. But another interesting result that we draw to in focusing on workplace well-being is what happens to the differences between staff and faculty and the differences between men and women. So in both cases, in sort of unconditional settings, the differences are negative between men and women and between staff and faculty. However, once we control for these perceptive measures, so going all the way to column 7, we see that these perceptive measures drag down the well-being of women and faculty to the point of making them worse off than their 2 relative groups, which is not a dynamic that we observed in the case of turnover intentions. So this is sort of the first part of the results, and what was actually our interest initially, although this is interesting as well, our interest was in looking at whether there are trade-offs to changing these perceptions. And the trade-off, again, is if we're improving the perceptions of one group, does that mean that we're making the perceptions of the other group worse? And so how we do this is by including to our regression models a set of 2-way interactions. So 2-way interactions between, on one hand, individuals' perceptions and the female dummy, and on the other between their perceptions and the faculty dummy. And basically speaking, this table is the same as 2 slides ago for turnover, in column 1, in that column 1 is the same as column 7 2 slides ago, but we add these two-way interactions. And there's two major results that we can point to in this table. On one hand, there aren't any trade-offs. So changing perceptions has the same effect on men and women, have the same effect on faculty and staff. Not only this, but controlling for these potential other interactive mechanisms doesn't take anything away from the main effects that we observed in terms of inclusion and masculinity. We then conduct the same analysis with the interaction terms replacing the main DV by workplace well-being. And one similarity is that the positive contribution of inclusion and the negative contribution of masculinity stand even controlling for these interactive measures. Again, support for gender equality, but relatively marginal compared to the two other perceptive measures. But the second box that you see on the slide is indicating somewhat of a trade-off. And so how we interpret this, given that it's the interaction between the female dummy and perceptions of gender equality support, is that increasing the perception of gender equality support benefits men more than it does women. There's some evidence of this in our data. So I will conclude on this and just open up with some of the implications that we think are important for organizations in economics, but perhaps should be looked into other areas of research. On one hand, masculine norms benefit neither men nor women, and they are particularly pervasive amongst faculty occupations. Importantly, improving perceptions of masculinity and inclusion appear as promising levers since they have no evident trade-offs for either groups of interest in our study. And so what you have on this slide is an indication of what it could look like for actual turnover using these back-of-the-envelope calculations that we develop further in the paper. The only evidence of trade-off that we do have is that men benefit from support to gender equality, whereas women don't. And in the paper, we discuss some of the other mechanisms or the channels that could be at play. We suggest perhaps gender fatigue, and this might be something to discuss together. But on my timer, that's exactly 20 minutes. So I'll start by just thanking you for your attention, and in particular, Natalia, for reviewing our paper, and open up for any discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to work on sharing my screen. Can everyone see this? And thank you very much. I'm very excited to discuss this paper. I just want to review briefly what the paper does and give just a tiny bit more detail about the variables that we're considering, and then I'll discuss it a little bit more. So this paper does a very broad sweeping survey, including over 300 faculty and over 700 staff members at 6 European business schools to give you a sense of sort of the geographic breadth. These are in Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Slovenia, and Slovakia, and they include throughout institution fixed effects so that we can understand a little bit that this is occurring sort of within the institutions. In terms of the dependent variables, as you saw, these include workplace well-being. These measures, just to, again, drill down a little bit more, include I am emotionally energized at work. I feel I have purpose at my work. I feel I'm able to continually develop as a person in my job. I have a strong sense of belonging toward my institution. And then one that was initially included, but not in the results that we saw, is among the people I work with, I feel there's a sense of brotherhood or sisterhood. In terms of turnover intentions, these are coming from the following questions. I've considered, or have you considered leaving your institution in the last year? And would you leave your institution for similar compensation elsewhere if it were offered? Then on the independent variables, these are actually very parsimonious, right? So we have for the gender equality support, my institution is committed to promoting gender equality. For the climate for inclusion, there are 3 items from Nishi's paper in 2013. This is, my institution is characterized by a non-threatening environment in which people can reveal their true selves. My institution commits resources to ensuring that employees are able to resolve conflicts effectively. And in my institution, employees' insights are used to rethink or redefine work practices. And finally, for the masculinity contest culture, this again is from Glick et al. In 2018. And here it's saying, if you don't stand up for yourself, other people will step on you. Admitting you don't know the answer looks weak. Taking days off is frowned upon, and it's important to be in good physical shape to be respected. So that's just sort of drilling down a little bit more into exactly what these variables are. This paper, I think, makes several really wonderful contributions. I think there's a very pragmatic approach to supporting workplace well-being and understanding whether people are intending to leave and trying to get at the why underlying that. And I think that is unbelievably valuable in sort of guiding actionable insights. I think some of the really wonderful insights that we can get already are understanding that sort of male and female faculty have different impressions of this contest culture. And that was sort of in the first table that Daisy showed us, that we can see that male faculty and staff tend to agree a little bit more. Likewise, I think it's really wonderful to be able to see that the sort of more pervasive genders, so here we might think of male faculty and female staff, are less likely to perceive this inclusive climate or the gender equality support. I think both of those are incredibly rich findings that are new and really do provide a lot of potential for digging deeper into exactly what's going on here. Of course, I think it's also magnificent that we can sort of see that in broad strokes, there don't appear to be these massive trade-offs between different groups when we are thinking about addressing these. Okay, so in terms of questions, I'm gearing this towards the fact that I think that this paper is really wonderful and is at its beginning-ish stages. And so these are sort of action items that I think could help bring this to a full flourishing. So just on a technical point, some of the items were from validated surveys, in fact, most of them. But some of them were cherry-picked, right? So we had from the culture of inclusion, that's an 18-point survey, and then only 3 of them were included. And so having a better understanding of exactly how they were selected and making sure that it still sort of is validated, I think is helpful. For instance, we know that certain surveys, when they're distilled down to only a few questions, are a little bit, have less signal than the full measure. And of course, there are these sort of trade-offs always in terms of how many questions can you get people to answer. So it's not a critique that they're that these sort of were distilled down to the meaningful ones, but really just a little bit more understanding of that. Also sort of understanding the pre-registration process, particularly because there was one element that was initially asked but not included in the measure, I think would just be helpful for a sense of transparency in terms of how this paper was put together. Sort of conceptual points that I think are really helpful to think about are 2 that I'd like to focus on right here. One is, do we think of this as sort of a male-female issue or more about the pervasive gender? And as you saw in sort of the last slide, I was noting that there were some similarities between female faculty members and male staff members, right? And that we saw in the first table, I believe, it's table 1 in the paper, that about 77% of the staff members are female. And it's almost reversed in terms of the faculty members. And, you know, as you can sort of think in terms of being a male nurse is very different than being a male surgeon, just in terms of the gender dynamics of your group. So too, being a male administrative assistant is likely different than being a male faculty member. And so whether we should be thinking about this as being intrinsically about whether it's male, female, or just about being in sort of the dominant or the pervasive gender group in your occupation seems potentially worth it. And what that means is that sort of in one of the tables there is included the female cross faculty dummy, and I would encourage that to be brought throughout all of the other tables as well, or doing what's more in the annex of focusing on just among the faculty population, what this looks like in terms of gender. And I think that gets to the sort of second conceptual point, which is that, are we thinking about this as a leaky pipeline? Because in the paper, the authors mentioned that they sort of include staff in order to parse out how much is coming from the climate in academia versus the organizational climate. And that would suggest that we really want to focus among faculty and see what the differences are there, and then look at staff and see what the differences are there, rather than including them all in the same analyses. I think this also sort of conceptually is very important when we think about the sort of measures that are being used. For example, Glick et al. Have in a different paper, they mentioned that sort of masculinity contest cultures end up being most vicious and prevalent in male-dominated occupations where there are extreme and precarious resources at stake, right? So we could easily think of tenure being in that category, whereas I guess it's harder to think about that being more relevant in the case of sort of staff members where there aren't as many extreme and precarious resources at stake. So again, I think these are two ways of getting at very similar action items, which are that I would find it very helpful to think about just faculty and just staff. And then in terms of the sort of most pragmatic element here, Glick et al. Really make this an argument about sort of contest culture being about a contest of who is the most masculine. And I would argue that from an action item going forward, I'm not convinced that it is the most helpful phrasing, because the items that are here that are included in this, what they consider contest culture of sort of dog-eat-dog world, show no weakness, that you really want to advocate for having work go first, and then also that it's always good to show strength and to show stamina, that those I think are no longer perpetuated only by men when we're thinking about academia, that those are also perpetuated sometimes by women. And to the extent that we don't want to engender any backlash or any resentment, I think it's probably not helpful to say that we need to like decrease masculinity, but it is much more actionable to say perhaps we want to decrease the dog-eat-dog world, that I think it's a little harder to defend a dog-eat-dog world. And likewise, I think it would be amazing if this paper sort of went a bit further in terms of saying, okay, now that we know that having a culture of inclusion is really helpful, what are those items that really support and make people feel as though they do have a culture of inclusion, or that they do have a sense of decreasing dog-eat-dog world. So anyway, I think this paper is incredible, and I'm so excited to be able to see where it goes next.
Thank you very much. Now we have 10 minutes to collect questions from the audience. And those online, raise your hands. Let me see whether I can. Yeah. Okay, any question? Matteo?
Thank you. Matteo Ciccarelli from European Central Bank. I'm not sure I understood, well, maybe it's not in the paper, or I don't know whether that could be discussed in the paper. But I'm not sure I understood what, in the end, could be good measures in an institution to actually improve the situation. So making this concept of masculinity, say, a different one. It's not just an institution. No, I think on this concept, we should be working everywhere. But what would be your suggestion? I mean, both of you, actually, if you have any idea about it.
Maybe I'll start,
Yes.
Natalia. But thank you for the review. And yes, that's a really good question. We try to address that with the data that we have in different ways. There's all of the data that we present in this paper. There are additional variables, for example, individuals' experience in the workplace. And what we see is that a lot of the variation in notably the perception of masculinity contest culture, although we'll think of a reframing as to how we can word that, is related to individuals' experience in the workplace. And so notably, there are very specific experience that we measure, such as sexual harassment or the opportunity to network with individuals in from a different gender group. And it seems that beyond the policies, it's more those type of experiences in the workplace that would be explaining the perceptions that individuals have. Although we don't discuss these results in the paper because there seems to be enough in just explaining the perceptions, if I remember correctly, it's those experiences of sexual harassment that are the most predictive of individuals' perceptions of masculinity in particular. And for the policies, what we were looking to do is for each of the institutions at the time where we distributed the survey, we equally surveyed them on the policies that they had in place relating to, so more tangible policies that they had in terms of inclusion, gender equality, anti-harassment, etc. And although there was some interesting work that we could do using lasso estimations, one of the issues is that we only have 6 institutions, so it's hard to know which policies. It doesn't give us enough variation in our data to know which policies would actually be affecting these perceptions. So that's maybe a bit of an unsatisfactory answer at the moment, but these are the sort of questions that we're looking into as to what are the actual implications to change perceptions in the workplace.
Before you go ahead, let me insist a bit on Mateo's question. Those are policies at the institution level, but don't you think that they will be a spillover from other academic institutions or even for other institutions? Should the policy or the interventions be at the institution level or more at the society level, something like legislation?
We could look at legislation, yeah. That's not something that we've looked into. It's not something that we've looked into. But what you would be saying is that we could perhaps explain some of the variation by looking at each country's context and looking at the legislation that they have. What we do also have in these policies is whether they were mandatory or not, so whether they're a legal requirement or not. So we did take that into consideration when looking at the extent to which these policies predicted perceptions. But again, just having 6 contexts doesn't disaggregate anything.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking more in terms of to have a more inclusive climate or to improve the masculinity perceptions in an institution. Which kind of policy and interventions what do you have in mind as policy and interventions that could actually do this job? Policy and interventions at the institutional level, or would you consider, which is your feeling, that actually there will be spillovers? Because we are talking about intentions to live, right? So will be spillovers across institutions.
My sense is that the policies, or my sense upon reviewing the literature, is that these policies would work best at the institutional level. And notably, when we were discussing with our DI officer at INSEAD, it's strong commitment or leadership commitment to inclusion that matters perhaps even more than whatever policies related to inclusion institutions put in place. So that could be also department leadership, so faculty leaders, dean leaders being committed to inclusion. But I think that what was most interesting in reviewing the literature on both equality and inclusion is that in the inclusion approach, individuals aren't singled out because of their gender or their minority status, etc. And there's a lot of rethinking in terms of what that would look like concretely. But yeah, I think perhaps stronger leadership towards a sense of inclusion is something that could be interesting to look into.
I would also add that sort of the elements of the contest culture, many of them have room for action, right? That sort of saying a show no weakness thing, that doesn't need to necessarily be legislated, but could be done from sort of senior faculty or senior staff members being more willing to sort of acknowledge and accept and maybe display their own weakness. Likewise, sort of having a informal desire to not only put work first, but to make space for other priorities in life. Again, does not necessarily need to be legislated, but could just come from very strong leadership.
Okay, thank you. We have time for another question. Okay, there are not more questions. We move to the next paper. Our next.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was actually a very interesting paper. Thank you. Sorry. Our next presenter is Marina Getzberg from Melbourne University, and is going to talk about the Me Too, the unintended consequences of Me Too, evidence from research collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for accepting the paper to this conference. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, it's very big and green. Yeah. So thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. The question that I'm looking at in this paper is whether Me Too impacted collaboration between women and men. And I'm studying this question within the context of the academic economics profession. And unfortunately, this became very topical again because economics seems to have its own Me Too moment at this very moment. So collaboration is crucial for the production of output. Collaborations result in higher productivity. They lead to work of more significance. And also it has been shown that more productive players are more likely to join teams. However, collaboration also requires social interaction that comes at a cost. And the gender gap in career outcomes partially is due to the fact that women collaborate less and have smaller networks. And therefore, events that make it even more difficult or increase the cost of collaboration for women are very consequential. Now, the event that I'm studying is the Me Too movement. It took place on October 15, 2017, and it is the day when Alyssa Milano tweeted that she was sexually harassed by Harvey Weinstein, and she encouraged other people who had similar experience to come forward as well. Now, the goal was to create awareness and expose a culture where sexual harassment was tolerated in the workplace. It was supposed to encourage victims to come forward and to enforce the punishment of perpetrators. So therefore, the overarching goal was to create a safer work environment for women. So then it should technically lead or allow women to collaborate more freely or less. It should make collaboration for women less costly. However, at the same time, there's also anecdotal and survey evidence that men are concerned of being accused of sexual harassment. And therefore, the question that I'm asking is whether on net Me Too increase or decrease the cost of collaboration. So this is a preview of my results. And as I already mentioned, I'm conducting my study within the area of economics and academia. And I look at the composition of collaborators on new project initiations of female academics, of female junior academics in the top 100 US departments. And I decompose their collaborations into non-overlapping combinations of co-authors. And what I find is that after Me Too, women start fewer new projects. They start 0.7 fewer new projects, going from an average of 1.7 new projects per year to roughly 0.9 new projects per year. And I also find that 60% of this decline comes from fewer new projects with male co-authors. So junior female academics experience a decline in productivity that is largely due to fewer collaborations with male co-authors. Now then there is the question, okay, are men or women backing off from collaborations? And here I find evidence that is consistent with the story that it is men who are backing off because they are concerned of sexual harassment accusations after Me Too. And what I find in particular is that collaborations are less negatively affected if sexual harassment policies are more clear and spelling out behaviors that are prohibited when the risk of reporting appears high. The contribution of this work is that it's essentially the first study to show evidence of a negative impact of Me Too on collaborations between women and men. I explored a setting where collaborations are crucial for career advancement, but they're voluntary. And therefore, it offers a beneficial setting to observe how collaboration changed after Me Too. And this work also has important policy implications in that it shows that design of clearer policies can help to mitigate this negative unintended consequence of Me Too. And in the remainder of the presentation, I will show you what empirical approach I took to come to these results. So as I already mentioned, I'm using academia as my lab to observe how collaborations change after Me Too. So there's a challenge to identify relevant interactions and measure their impact on career critical outcomes. So for example, if you think of mentoring, this is a very informal activity, so it's really difficult to observe mentoring matches. Also, if you think, for example, about the consulting industry, so there people also have to work in teams and collaborate. However, there people are put in teams, so it's difficult to really observe a response after Me Too. So people don't enter collaborations voluntarily. And academic careers are dependent on collaborations and social interaction. And in particular, the research projects of junior academics are quite suitable here because output for junior academics is very relevant, so there's a lot of pressure to produce in order to get tenure during your tenure track while you're in junior. Collaborations are vital for productivity. So there are very few solo authored projects in academia. And again, these co-authorships are formed voluntarily. The output is measurable, so it is a working paper. And the nature of interactions is very much prone to ambiguous social interaction. That is because of how casual these work relationships are. So we meet outside of working hours, we go together for lunch, for dinner, we stay longer, we work on the weekends. So research ideas are born outside of the office. So this is a very specific work environment that we are part of. And women are underrepresented in economics, meaning that a lot of women will have naturally male co-authors, and also key decision makers are still men and have the most resources. So it is also consequential. My sample consists of junior female academics who obtained their PhD in or after 2014 and who are on a tenure track in 2017, that is pre-Me Too, in one of the top 100 US economics departments. So why is that the sample that I'm choosing? It is to make sure that the junior female academics don't have tenure yet, so it remains in a 6-year tenure clock. As a junior academic, you're very sensitive to career disruptions. And what is also very important for my empirics is that junior academics update their vita frequently with new work. And this is essentially the source of the data that I'm using. So in total, I have 83 junior female academics. People might think, okay, this is not a big sample, but this is the population of junior female academics in top 100 economics department who are on a tenure track at that time. And overall, I have 393 year person observations, and overall, I'm looking at 1,200 projects of these junior academics. And the approaches that I'm taking, I'm decomposing every project into non-overlapping combination of co-authors and see how this composition changes pre relative to post-Me Too. And I'm decomposing it into various dimensions, into male, female, new, existing, inside, outside, and the seniority of the co-author. So this is how it looks like. I start with a total number of projects per year, and then I go into authored, co-authored. I go into projects with faculty and non-faculty, and then I divide it into male, female, and mixed co-author teams, and then new and existing co-authors, and then co-authors inside the same universities and outside of the same university. And then I look into seniority. So the outcome variable in the regression that I'm running is the number of projects per year with a certain type of co-author combination. My main variable of interest is the post-Me Too dummy. Post-Me Too means that it's as of 2018. And I'm looking at the same junior female academic at the same institution, pre and post-Me Too. And I'm including some important controls, and the most important control is the number of years since the academic entered the tenure track. So they're very specific career trends. So usually throughout the career, you increase the number of projects, and this essentially reflects it. So I'm comparing a person at the same career stage pre and post Me Too. And what I count as a new project initiation is the existence of a new working paper or a new work in progress paper on the CV of the female academic. So I'm collecting all historical CVs for all the junior female academics. I'm doing that using the Wayback Machine. So every time there is an update, I'm recording it as a new project. So I'm not looking at publications, and I'm also checking for the first appearance of this project in seminars or conferences. And what I'm seeing here is the trend in the number of projects over the career of men and women. So this can be viewed as summary statistics. And what this shows is that there is a change in the productivity over the tenure life cycle for women. So what we can see here with the solid lines, with the blue one, we see how many new projects someone who was in their first year started pre-Me Too, and the orange line shows how many new projects a junior female academic who was in her first year started after Me Too. And we see that essentially women after Me Too are missing out on a trend that they're not picking back up. And this is important because tenure requirements are made based on an expected progression within your career. And after Me Too, women fall behind in this productivity growth. And this does not happen for men. So what I'm showing here is where the decline in collaboration for women comes from. So these are marginal effects. And again, this is very similar to what I showed you in the map in the very beginning. So what we can see here, after Me Too, women start 0.9 new projects as opposed to 1.6 new projects pre-Me Too. And we can see that the major decline comes from fewer new projects with male co-authors. And what is also very important here, women don't compensate for these missing projects with men in that they don't start more projects that are solo authored or that are with women. So women just lose in productivity and don't pick up the lost projects anywhere. Now I zoom into the projects with men and try to understand, okay, which group of men is driving this decline? And what I find is that the largest decline is driven by fewer new projects with male co-authors who are at the same university. So it's new co-authors who are at the same university as a junior female academic. I also find a decline in collaborations with existing co-authors. And when I look at the maps for men, this is something that I don't show here, I see that men actually collaborate more with men, with their existing co-authors. So it looks a little bit like men are directly replacing these projects with their existing network, and women just don't do that. So it seems that women lose in productivity after Me Too. They start fewer new projects, and that is largely due to fewer collaborations with male co-authors, and in particular, new male co-authors who are at the same institution as the junior female academic. And then the big question is who is driving, who is backing off? And that is a very, very difficult question in nature to answer. It's very difficult to observe this bargaining process that is going on when you're starting a new project. So it's very difficult to pinpoint who is really backing off and where does a collaboration essentially start. However, there is anecdotal evidence and survey evidence that men are concerned of being sexually harassed, that they're being accused of sexual harassment, and that they intend to manage this risk by stop working with women. After Me Too, there was a lot of public naming and shaming. Organizations announced zero tolerance policies towards sexual harassment, and there was also increased reporting and detection of sexual harassment. And also there is survey evidence that men are reporting they're not sure anymore what behavior is considered appropriate in the workplace. So what I'm testing is whether there is something to this channel that men perceive a higher risk of being accused of sexual harassment and therefore are backing off from collaborating with women. And what I'm showing here, so I posted a Twitter thread of my paper and I received a lot of reactions. And I'm showing you the reactions that received the most likes and were most retweeted. And here Diana says, definitely husband is senior manager. He wouldn't dream of a one-on-one lunch with a female associate anymore or a closed-door meeting, and the other person also says something along those lines. So it seems that men are really thinking that the risk of being accused of sexual harassment is very, very high and that they're on the verge of losing everything, and that the only remedy is to stop working with women. Now, this is, of course, not necessarily representative, but I just wanted to show you this most popular response that I received to the thread that I posted about my paper. So do men manage a perceived increased risk of sexual harassment accusations after Me Too? So what is happening after Me Too? Me Too increases the public pressure for institutions to side with the accusers. However, decisions about employment continuation is still made by the university through the internal investigations, and this is what I'm exploiting. So I'm hypothesizing that men perceive a higher risk of sexual harassment accusations when sexual harassment policies are not clear in spelling out prohibited behavior. So a very vague policy exposes someone to more potential claims. Now, for example, a very vague policy could have been more protecting of men pre-Me Too. So when there was an accusation, a vague policy could have been used in order to side with men. However, this vague policy exposes them to more claims after Me Too when there is more pressure for institutions to side with the accusers. Now, a policy that is more specific and specifies which behaviors are allowed and not allowed leaves less uncertainty, and therefore the risk of being subject to sexual harassment accusations should be less pronounced after Me Too relative to a more vague policy. And I'm also looking in particular at environments where the probability of reporting appears high. That is based on a paper on Cheng and Xiao, who showed that reporting is more likely when there are already reports. So I'm also looking at environments that have already a high number of public accusations. Now, what is also important is that women's choice to work with men should not be impacted by policy clarity. So this should isolate this channel. So I'm relating ambiguity in the definitions of sexual harassment policies and the reporting environment to the number of collaborations between women and men who are at the same institution. That is important because sexual harassment policies cover individuals only who are in the same institution. That is also a large aspect that is currently being discussed. And so my explanatory variables are the reporting environment and policy ambiguity. And policy ambiguity is measured by the number of examples of prohibited behaviors that are mentioned in a sexual harassment policy of a university at the time when Me Too hits. So that's the last existing policy that was in place at the time of Me Too. And now I just want you to show examples of a vague policy and a more clear policy. So this is an example of a vague policy. It just defines sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical contact of sexual nature. So it is very difficult to understand what is allowed and what is not allowed. Now, this is an example of a more clear sexual harassment policy. So here we can see that verbal sexual harassment may include unwelcome conduct, such as sexual flirtation. They also mention requests for dates. They also mention display or wearing of objects or items of clothing which express sexually offensive content. So what you could think of, for example, is a T-shirt of a band that, you know, maybe is somewhat inappropriate and makes some sexual contains some sexual content. So it is way more explicit, and if you read this, you could think, okay, I should maybe not ask my colleague a second time for a date. I should not wear my favorite band T-shirt. And this is the main regression. So what we can see here if after Me Too, a university has a lot of public sexual harassment incidents, so the reporting environment is high, and it has a bad or vague sexual harassment policy, collaborations between men and women at the same institution decrease. However, if after Me Too, the university, with a lot of cases, has a policy that is more clear, that decrease is less pronounced. So this is a summary of my results. I show that women start fewer new projects after Me Too. That is largely due to fewer collaborations with men. Women don't replace these collaborations by starting more new projects with women or solo projects. Men don't have this decline in productivity that women have. And the decline in collaborations between women and men is larger when sexual harassment policies are vague and the reporting environment is such that reporting is more likely. And that is consistent with men managing increased perceived risk of sexual harassment accusations after Me Too. And as I said, there are also some important policy implications of this work. So for one, it is important for organizations to support the Me Too movement by putting policies in place. And that is clear policy. So it is important to talk about what appropriate behavior is and to spell it out. Of course, it is impossible to manage human relationships entirely, and a completely clear policy is unlikely to exist, but less vague is better than more vague. And also it is important to take the negative productivity effects for women into account in tenure or promotion decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. Just on time. Now we have Kevin Deverret from Peking University discussing. It's online, okay.
Can you see the slides?
Yeah, you have 10 minutes, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, great, 10 minutes. Okay, I'll go quick then. Okay, so first I want to say this is a very well done paper. It's convincing and it's on a timely subject. So the research question is, did the Me Too movement result in fewer collaborations between senior male and junior female academic economists? So we look at some other groups in the paper, but this is the main one that we're interested in. We think that the junior females might have a lot to gain career-wise by working with the senior males, but that the Me Too movement has an effect on the incentives, potentially both ways to do so, probably more so coming from the senior males. So this is a classic type of economics paper, unintended consequences, this time not of a policy explicitly, but of a social movement with policy implications. And so this really has economic thinking to it. So I think it'll appeal to people who are familiar with minimum wage papers, this type of thing. So there's a lot you can talk about the general equilibrium effects of all the incentives involved here. Is it welfare increasing? Is it welfare decreasing? We're looking here at one very particular reaction, which is likely the senior males withdrawing from working with junior females. So overall, from the Me Too movement, and let's limit it to thinking about academic economics, there are ambiguous welfare effects because presumably it discourages harassment, so that's good, but it may discourage these beneficial interactions. On the other hand, it may discourage the interactions that are not happening, the co-authorships that are not happening are potentially harassment relationships, which are no longer happening. So this paper wisely takes a very narrow focus. Just, is there this reaction in junior female, senior male co-authorship? So we can set aside, the paper cites some other theory papers that think about the general equilibrium effects. We need to know this first before we go into anything else. We need to know it empirically. So if not, we shouldn't worry too much about negative welfare effects of Me Too, because if these relationships are still going on, well, we think that probably there's going to be less harassment, now that we've overcome a collective action problem. And we're not going to lose out on these beneficial interactions. But the paper does find a decrease in these co-authorships. So the welfare effects, I think, are still ambiguous because it could be the exploitative co-authorships are being lost. It could be good, socially efficient co-authorships are being lost, but we find that something is being lost. Let me skip through this. So I think this does have implications for other settings like business, politics, other professional settings, where you have these self-directed professional relationships. But of course, in academic economics, these co-authorships are publicly observable, so we can actually put a data set together. The data is comparable to other papers that have used this type of data. A few of them are cited in the paper. So I think the data set is good. I wouldn't worry about a small number of observations. You know, you have 30, you're getting to asymptotics rule of thumb. So I wouldn't worry about small sample size. I put together the event studies of the women and men, and I noticed, Marina, you did the same in the presentation, and I think, although not in the paper, but I think this is a really handy way to look at it. So I'm just going to talk about the identification approach using these diagrams. So I'll keep the men on the side for now, and I'm going to be focusing on the women. So the first difference that you point out in the text, although you don't make a big deal of it for the main estimates, is in the first year of this cohort that is post-Me Too for junior women, they're having lower output than these women who go through 3 years of their career and then fall into Me Too. Okay, and you also point out that this difference continues and it's actually a little bit bigger. So this estimator that I've drawn here, you don't actually make a big deal of it, but even if this were the only data we had, this would already be pretty convincing. So the difference in means between these new women who are starting their career in the Me Too era versus the women who have had a few years before that happened, it's already a big difference in productivity. But of course, there are cohort effects. These could potentially be a very different group of women. Now, I think you make a convincing argument against that because this second group of women has already got their jobs. I think their jobs have already been arranged by the time they're starting. So they shouldn't be a selected sample. But who knows? They are different cohorts. There could be some difference between them. But I think even before we get to the main estimator, there is very convincing evidence. So there's a within estimator, individual fixed effects because we have a panel, and semi-parametric controls, dummies for experience, how many years on the tenure track. So let me just draw this out. I'll skip through the equation because you showed it. One minor point I wanted to make is some of the control variables, I'd like to see some specifications without them, just to see what it looks like. It would also make them more comparable to the placebo group, which you don't have some of the observables for them, but it's a very minor point. Okay, so let me go to the main identification approach. Here is a group that went a little bit longer, junior women who went a little bit longer. Now they had 4 years before Me Too hit them. Okay, so again, they're potentially they are a different cohort, potentially different level productivities. So let's take away the mean of that. That is, let's take away the individual fixed effects. Okay, and now they're on the same level. Okay. And now the actual estimator for the main results is comparing here in a given year, year 4, on the tenure track, of these women who have been affected by Me Too and these women who have not yet but will next year. Okay, so this is a very convincing estimate. I don't think you can come up with many objections to this. So the main result looks very solid. I don't have any complaints about that. I think the paper is pretty much done. I read through. You've done almost everything I've come up with. So let me make a few of my suggestions, a few of my thoughts that might be tangential, might be going off the subject for another paper, but I'll show you them now. So you have a placebo group of never treated women that you cover in the appendix. And then among these, so their tenure track sort of ends in 2017. Among them, you have this false treatment where these years are treated, placebo treated, and there's no effect. So, more convincing evidence. But potentially you could use them as another control group. It's a small point here, but these differences here between the never treated women and then the treated women are a potential additional source of information. Okay. So what about men? I'll use the last couple minutes to talk about men. So are the junior males taking the co-authorships that junior females are losing or forfeiting, that is, they're giving it up? So they're not quite a placebo group because they are affected by Me Too, right? So here I've drawn this other treatment, and you do this. You have the figure in the appendix that covers this, and here is men who are treated by Me Too earlier, actually increasing their output, right? Having more papers. Okay, so this is a fake line that I've made up, but I think it corresponds to your results, and this shows who's picking up the pieces here. Okay. Now, you find that the raw effects are pretty small, but overall men work more with men after Me Too. But I think you could push this further because there are more men typically in economics departments. And to the extent there are more junior males and junior females, this is scaled down. And so, yeah, the raw effect is small, but the total number of projects maybe is evening up. And I do see suggestive evidence in your paper that the substitution could be significant. Okay, so here I've overlaid the actual men's event study onto the women. And so, this trend here, okay, so they kind of level off for a while, and then there's a big jump in the last year. Who knows how big that is? And if this is 2020, it could tie into the pandemic that you also have another appendix on. So let's not make too much of this here, but potentially this could be the men picking up the pieces that the women are not getting. But here in these junior cohort effects of just the 3 years where all their careers within Me Too, so the men are getting a lot more papers, a lot more projects than women. So of course, these could both be selected cohorts, selected in potentially different ways if you think Me Too is affecting the job market allocation process. But I'm not that worried about selection, as I said in the very first estimate I put up. It is a concern, but also you have the data to push this further. So I think that's interesting. To really push it further, you could talk about doing this two-way discrete choice. So authors of any type are thinking about matching to authors of any other type. You can recover the match value. And so my hypothesis here is that the match value of senior male to junior female is decreasing because of some perceived risk. And that then the relative value of the senior male, junior male matches is increasing, right? So you basically, if there are more of this type of match, senior male, junior male, then the utility is increasing to them. And that would not, because it's proportional to the populations of each, it would not be scaled down by the fact that there are many, many men in the department. Okay. So do I have any time left?
0 minutes.
Okay. So I'll cover the rest of this stuff. I have some minor comments, but it's a very interesting paper on a timely subject. So thanks very much for providing that, and it was very interesting to read.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very interesting discussion.
Very interesting paper. Thank you so much. I actually have a couple of questions, and one of them I think is probably an obvious one about COVID-19. Your sample period, I missed it probably when it ends, but if it overlaps with the COVID period, there is obviously, especially in the beginning of COVID, there was a decline in the productivity of women in terms of paper and collaboration, so on and so forth. So I would like to hear a bit more about how you controlled for that, if you did. And the second one is I would like to hear your thoughts about your policy suggestion about having a clear sexual harassment policies. My understanding is that when the collaborators are in different institutions, it's very difficult to report this sexual harassment because the policies in different institutions are different. So even if the policies are written clearly, would it address the situation or the problem if the collaborators are working in different institutions? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. COVID, so my sample period goes until 2020, so includes the COVID year. COVID starts in the second quarter or the end of the first quarter of 2020. It is included in my sample period. However, so one thing about how I collect the data, so I'm looking at work in progress and working papers. So what happens is a project has started likely somewhat earlier than I observe it. So it is unclear to what extent it covers COVID. But I have 3 different robustness checks for that, and the result is actually quite interesting. So in one of the robustness checks, I just include the year 2020. In another robustness check, I look at every paper in 2020 and allocate it whether it started likely after COVID started or before, and there are a lot of COVID papers, so it's not that difficult. And then I only use that part and extrapolate this trend. And essentially all of these results, and I also exclude this year entirely, and all of my results are robust to this. And the interesting finding is that it actually seems that Me Too was worse for the productivity of women than COVID. So it actually becomes less bad after COVID. And that could be, of course, because the effects of Me Too taper off a little bit. It could be because of the virtual nature of interactions during COVID. So it seems to make it less worse. I don't know exactly why, whether COVID drives that, whether this is Me Too. It's probably a combined effect. But yeah, so my results are robust to the COVID period. With respect to policies, so indeed is the case currently that sexual harassment policies are only covering employees of a particular university, and if collaborators are in different universities, it's very, very difficult to make a claim because it's unclear which university should investigate. And it's also a part of the debate, I think, that economics is facing now, because a lot of sexual harassment is happening at conferences, as it seems, and there people are usually from different departments. So yeah, we discussed this during lunch, so probably associations should think of umbrella policies. They should still be clear.
Okay, let me take a question from the online participants. Natalia, can you turn on? Yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 brief comments. One is, if you think that sort of women are fleeing from collaborating with men, you might imagine that some of this could be driven by Heather Sarson's paper, suggesting that women actually get less credit even when they do equal work. And so you might imagine, as sort of a placebo check, looking at when that paper was released, and as memory serves, that was 2015, and seeing whether there's sort of anything there, just to be able to sort of rule that out. The other piece is, I think you could leverage the Me Too moment now, if you wanted to do a survey to sort of understand what professors' perceptions are of the likelihood of being falsely accused, their perceptions of the cost of being accused falsely or not, as well as what actions they might be taking to prevent it. And you could even go so far as to understand whether they have clarity or not in terms of their institution's policy by giving them sort of vignettes. Anyway, so those were just 2 ideas. Anyway, thanks for a wonderful paper.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm aware of Heather Sarson's paper and whether the effects I find are essentially the effect of Heather Sarson's. So in order for me to find this effect, women should actually get negative credit from collaborating with men, not just less. Also, they are not starting more projects by themselves or with other women, which is what the paper of Heather Sarson suggests. And I also wanted to actually examine whether there is something to it. So I looked where Heather Sarson presented that paper in 2015, and it's very difficult to find places where she presented it outside of Harvard. So my impression is that she submitted it fairly quickly to AER paper and proceedings. So that was unfortunately not possible. But I think the main thing is that for like my result would imply that women get negative credit from collaborating with men. And I also agree that the recent Me Too moment in economics is very interesting, and I should be thinking of doing something with that. On the other hand, it is likely that the Me Too moment in Hollywood also kind of led to the Me Too moment in economics, so people are already treated. And I was also thinking of doing potentially a survey, but I'm just concerned that men would not answer truthfully that they're concerned about working with women. But yeah, maybe some sort of survey now would be useful. I have to think about what the best approach would be. But it's a really interesting environment. I agree, unfortunately.
A very short one.
Thanks. It was a really interesting presentation. Just two quick things. The first is the institutional questions that you were asking about the nature of the sexual harassment policies. One, I was wondering if there were any policy changes that took place around the time of Me Too, and if you could exploit policy changes, and if you thought at all about whether the policies were a reflection of the organization's culture rather than the driver of the behavior. So I guess I'm trying to, so is the policy reflecting like the underlying culture of the organization already versus it's the policy that's doing the work of making people feel more at risk for the vagueness in the policy for that. The second thing is, I don't know if you looked at, there's a management science paper that looked at the effects of Me Too, specifically, you're nodding, so I'm guessing you're familiar with that paper. But that was just making me think of, so in that paper, they find that producers who worked with Harvey Weinstein actually increased the amount of female writers that they worked with, which is the opposite of what you find here. And those people were actually close to Weinstein. So I'm very confused about what's going on with the risk assessment. And so I wondered if this was like an academic specific thing that you thought or an economic specific thing that you thought about, and if you thought about other departments to see if this is economics versus just academia. Sorry, I know that was a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. Marina, try to be short.
Okay, very short. Yeah. So the management science paper, so in the situation in Hollywood is different because it is actually a shock to supply. So it changes the industry landscape because 50% of the production firms were actually owned by Harvey Weinstein. We don't have a shock. So here we can in the economics profession, we can observe the behavioral response without having a shock to the composition. Yeah, maybe I discuss the rest in a break.
Exactly. The rest of this question and also any other pending questions. I'm sorry, but we have to keep going. Very interesting. And so now we have Eddie Hengel. So now we have Erin Hengel from University College of London talking about gender and time cost of peer review. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is this, yeah. Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation. This is a paper I have jointly with Diane Alexander at Wharton and Olga Gorelkina at the University of Liverpool. So what we're really kind of looking at or wanting to investigate is this so-called productivity paradox in academia. So it's been well documented that on average, men tend to produce more papers than women. And this is something that shows up starting early in the career, and it only widens over the career path. But there is quite a bit of evidence that actually suggests that this gender gap is not something that is necessarily preordained. So there may be something that we specifically can do about it. So first of all, it tends to be smaller in fields where research is easier to produce. If you think about this, like a very expensive field would be physics, because you have to buy the equipment, for example, a collider. Less expensive fields might be history, where you need to have access to the archives, but it's, you just have to physically be there. It also tends to be present particularly in prestigious outlets, and so it's less present in outlets that are less prestigious. And it's also, and I think this is important, something that came up earlier today, the whole way that you actually decide on how to measure productivity. So if you were to, for example, take productivity and measure in terms of other things, you actually find that women excel in academia. So there's some evidence to suggest that they tend to do relatively well on teaching, at least on the teaching load, and perhaps also the service to the profession. So what we're specifically doing is kind of investigating one very almost narrow aspect of what could be influencing productivity, women's productivity in academia, and might be influencing why they end up with this larger gap. And it's the publication process. And it was based on a finding that I had in an earlier paper I had, and one of the things in that paper was suggesting that eventually accepted papers to top economics journals tended to go through a lot longer peer review when they were authored by women versus when they were authored by men. So in this paper, we're seeking to better understand this result, and also see how and why it could eventually affect women's productivity, and whether there's anything that we might be able to do about it. So the specific questions we're looking at answering are, in particular, so we have this other result that's suggesting conditional acceptance. We have this much bigger, women are taking longer to go through peer review. Is this, again, conditional acceptance? Is this because referees are taking longer with women's papers, or is it because authors themselves are taking long to revise? And then if we do actually find that one or both of these gaps exist, is there anything we can do about it? And what we're going to specifically look at is whether the experience and information that a referee has can actually impact how wide this gap is. So basically, do these gaps depend on how informed referees are about journal standards of acceptance, as well as the referee's skill and accuracy at assessing manuscript quality? And in order to test this, we're basically going to exploit kind of the assumption of exogenous variation referee assignment, and then see how these gaps evolve as the same referee gains more experience in the refereeing process at a particular journal. So the data we have is for a journal in economics, a field journal called Energy Economics. It is a single-blind reviewed field journal for the entire process. The data were obtained with the permission and cooperation of the editor, Richard Tall, very helpful. Now, we collected the data in 3 steps. So we first collected publicly available data on each of the papers that were either already published or forthcoming in Energy Economics as of April 2019. We then intended to go on to our 3rd step, but we discovered actually in the process of doing our 3rd step, we discovered actually that at Elsevier, a lot of people, when they're refereeing papers, and you may know this for yourself, you actually have multiple logins. So what we're really keen on, again, is getting at something that's going to proxy for the amount of information that a referee has in the refereeing process, and so we want to use their experience. And so we had to deal with that. So basically what we did for the 2nd step is that we extracted the names of all the referees who had ever refereed for Energy Economics, as well as their institution, their email addresses, and then we consolidated that list. So then that gave us a list of all the people who had refereed for this journal, and it also gave us an indicator for how many times they had actually refereed, so which we will end up using as our proxy for experience and information. And then in the final step, we basically wrote a Python program that downloaded all of the available information from Elsevier's editorial system, and then it matched the records that we had in our step 1 and our step 2 to create a large data set that basically had all of the information, the publicly available information on eventually accepted papers in Energy Economics. as well as the the private information on how long these papers took in review, how long each referee took with it, their evaluations for the papers, et cetera. Now, we only look at accepted papers, and there are two good reasons why we do this. So the main reason we do this is really kind of for, there are two. They're both important, I suppose. But the conceptual reason is really because we're looking to avoid a situation where no information is being conveyed between the referee and the author. So there is actually quite a bit of literature in economic theory on basically like how is information conveyed, when does it have meaning. We want to avoid kind of babbling equilibrium. And I kind of think about this one time that I refereed a paper where the other referee actually ended up rejecting it, and wrote like a half page of just, didn't really convey any information because they had no incentive to convey any information about that. And they clearly probably didn't take very long to write the actual report because they decided we're just going to reject, we're going to move on. We're looking at situations where there is the referee is engaging necessarily in good faith and really wants to convey information. And then conditional on that good faith decision to want to convey information, how much longer are they spending with women's papers as opposed to men, and is this affected by information? The other reason is a practical reason. There are a lot of papers that are submitted to journals that are just desk rejected, or they're rejected very quickly. And it is actually you have no information, publicly available information on these papers because they're never published, or they're published in a form that is completely different. You can't find any information on that paper. There are also certain countries that had systems in place. I think at one point Iran, for example, had a requirement that in order to get your master's degree, you had to actually submit your thesis for the master's degree to an actual journal. So you would end up with like a lot of master's students who were submitting their theses, which often would end up getting, and they were never published either. So for that reason, we think it's really important eventually to look at non-accepted papers, but it's a big undertaking, and we will not look at it at this paper. Okay, before can I just ask how much longer I have? Do you know? So before I move on to the main results, I just want to kind of give you an overview of kind of some summary statistics. So we end up having about 2,500 articles in our database, about 350 of which have a female corresponding author, which is the way that we are measuring gender in this paper. We also, however, not in this version of the paper, but I can also answer your questions in an updated version. We actually show it using a lot of other ways to proxy for gender. We see over here on the left-hand side that there has been an increasing number of manuscripts submitted and published per year in energy economics. However, the proportion of those that have a female corresponding has remained relatively flat in this particular journal at about 15% for the entire period that we're looking at. Now, this is the time spent with referees. So this is about 7,500 observations of referees reviewing a paper, about 1,000 of which have a female corresponding author, and most of which recommended rejection. And again, we're looking at good faith transmission of information. So we're only looking at situations in which the referee did not recommend rejection. And energy economics has a policy of pretty much only publishing papers if all the referees recommend acceptance. So that's why the overlap between observations of all accepted papers and those that were actually were also accepted by referees is very close. So on the left-hand side, we have the total number of days that a paper spends with referees. And surprisingly, we actually find that has been relatively flat over our time period as well. And on the right-hand side, we have the distribution. And we see, female author papers spend a bit longer in peer review, under review by referees than male author papers. And this is the time spent with authors. So this is the time that authors who have received a revise and resubmit decision spend under being revised by the authors themselves. We now have about 4,000 observations, about 600 of which have a female corresponding an author, and we basically see the exact same trend from the previous slide. So we have the average number of days spent with authors has actually not increased over our time period, but the distribution of the days with authors does differ by gender, and female authors are spending longer revising their papers compared to male authors. And then quickly, just one final one, summary statistics. These are the rounds of review. So on the left-hand side, we have the average number of rounds a paper goes through before it is accepted. And on the right-hand, again, pretty flat, same trend as before. On the right-hand side, we have the distribution of rounds by author gender. And we see that women are underrepresented in like papers that get accepted within the first or second round, and they're overrepresented in papers that get accepted in the third, fourth, et cetera round. So for our main analysis, basically what we're doing is a round-specific analysis of non-rejected papers. What we have to do is basically, we want to be able to compare two papers that there is kind of a normative assumption, a general agreement that these papers probably should have spent about the same amount of time in peer review. So we're going to condition on what we think probably should have decided the overall decision in the peer review process. And that is kind of this vaguely named quality. But this is a normative assumption. So we're making conditional on quality. We're saying we think that these papers should probably go through about the same difficulty in peer review process. Now, what makes it hard for us, of course, is what is quality, right? What is this thing that referees are supposed to be deciding? Well, we use several proxies. We think that some proxies are probably going to lead to a gap that is underestimated and some that are overestimated. We believe the true estimate is somewhere between these bounds. And then just very quickly, what we're really estimating is both direct discrimination as well as indirect or systemic discrimination. So it can include forms of things like obviously direct bias, but it can also include things that are sometimes we don't even think fully as discrimination, and this is what I'll talk about later, but like statistical discrimination in the form of like where you have a paper that you're not necessarily, you're taking longer to review it, not necessarily because it has anything to do with the actual characteristics of the author, but there is something about that paper that actually makes it harder for you to review for whatever reason. For example, it could just be, men, for example, predominantly male referees may just have a harder time understanding female author papers. Not because they're necessarily female, so to say, but because there's something about the writing within that captures that. And that is kind of in the legal literature, that's also considered a form of like indirect discrimination. So we're also capturing that. And we also emphasize that we have here is a contemporaneous measure of discrimination. So it's what's occurring at this particular point in time, and it is not cumulative. So here are our kind of main estimates. What we have here, this is the gender difference in the time spent with referees. Again, this is going to be round specific. So this is the amount of the gender gap per round. And what we're basically doing is regressing the amount of time that referees spent with that particular paper on whether it was authored by a female corresponding author, as well as our proxy for quality, the round, and year fixed effects. I'm only showing these control variables here because I generally like to show it with the least amount of controls, but in the paper we also control for a plethora of other things such as experience of the author, page length, etc. And basically what we find is controlling for current round as well as manuscript quality as proxy for by citations, referee recommendations, so fixed effects for the different type of recommendations a referee could have made of the paper, as well as fixed effects for the editor's decision, so the different decisions the editor could have made at the end of the round. We find that referees spend about 4 to 5 days longer reviewing women's papers per round, and again, I emphasize this is per round, so this can actually add up to be a couple of weeks once you include all of the different rounds of the paper. Now here are the main results for the amount of time spent with authors. So now what we're doing is we're regressing the amount of time that authors spend revising their papers after receiving a revise and resubmit decision. Again, it's per round. And we're regressing that on a dummy variable equal to 1 if it's a corresponding author is woman, as well as our proxy for quality. Again, the round and the year fixed effects. And I emphasize again, we also show in the paper results with other control variables like page length and author experience. But we're seeing basically the same thing. Basically, controlling for year fixed effects, round and manuscript quality. We find that citations, in this case we have like citations, the editor's decision in the previous round, as well as the editor's decision in the current round. So those are our proxies for quality. We find that women spend about 2 weeks more revising their manuscripts during each round of review. And again, because they tend to go through a couple rounds, this can be a non-trivial amount. Now, like I kind of hinted at the very beginning, what we're really interested in is understanding, kind of ruling out possible explanations, or more importantly, like understanding whether referee experience has any kind of impact here, and whether there's something we can do to improve referee experience to lessen these gaps. So basically what we do here, on the first panel, we're just regressing again the exact same thing we had 2 slides ago. So the dependent variable is going to be the amount of time that a paper spends with referees. And in the first 2 columns, we're using female corresponding author as the W variable, and for gender. And in the third column, we're using whether or not it was a solo female authored paper as our representation of gender. And basically what we see is that on the first column, we see, first of all, it's actually slightly higher, so it's about 5 days longer. So female author papers spend about 5 days longer in peer review after controlling for experience. And basically what that's saying is when they're reviewed by novice referees, we see this gap. We also find that the interaction between experience and female is not significant in columns 1 and 2, but it is significant in the third column. And also it's interesting to see that in the third column, we see actually this gap actually widens. The final panel is the amount of time the paper is spending with authors. Exact same kind of situation. Once we control for referee experience, we see actually the variable on female, so the gender gap is widening. What that's saying is that when female author papers are being reviewed by novice referees, the gap is actually particularly astute. And again, in the final column, that's where female author is being defined by solo author papers, and there it's actually quite large. We see the experience, so the interaction between experience and female is also negative in all 3. So basically what that's saying is, take column 5, because this is a controlling for referee fixed effects. This is saying that when the same paper is being reviewed, when the same referee is reviewing a paper, when he had less experience, the gap was larger than when he had more experience. Now here is basically, I'm redoing exactly what I had in the last graph, except now I've taken, instead of using a continuous variable for experience, I've now broken experience into 3 kind of chunks. So there's novice referees, expert referees, which have about 10 to 19 papers that they've previously reviewed for energy economics, and then the small number of power referees. These are people who referee all the time for energy economics. This is not a large number of people, but they end up refereeing a lot of the papers that are published in energy economics. So they have a really good idea of actually what it takes to be an energy economics publishable paper, because of course they're setting that standard regularly. And again, we're seeing the exact same thing. So in green, we do not have referee fixed effects. In purple, we do have referee fixed effects, and I think that's kind of the most interesting. Basically, again, what it's saying is that when the same referee is getting more experience, his gender gap, the amount of time that authors are spending responding to his report, that gender gap is actually declining. We'd see the same thing when we're using the amount of time spent with referees as the dependent variable. But of course, the drop-off really only happens amongst power referees. So very quickly, what's going on? I'll stop here. We see that both gender gaps are declining and eventually disappear as kind of referees' experiences increase. Now, we are interpreting this as in isolation. There are many different explanations you could come up with this, but these joint results, we are interpreting as statistical discrimination. And we're defining statistical discrimination according to kind of this understanding in Ager and Kane, which is basically it is any kind of discrimination that would not occur if there were perfect information. So it can only exist with imperfect information. And this includes beliefs based on correct as well as incorrect information. So that's direct discrimination. It also includes situations in which referees have a harder time evaluating female author papers because there's some component of those papers that just makes it harder for them to understand. So it could be writing style, or perhaps they're using shortcuts to evaluate papers that just are less effective for female authored research. So this is a kind of indirect discrimination. And again, that's kind of the type of statistical discrimination that's can be found in Ager and Kane. And so what it suggests really is that less experienced referees are kind of less sure about the standards of acceptance at energy economics, and less knowledgeable about the process of peer review. and spend more time, for whatever reason, scrutinizing the papers that they're more unsure about, effectively. And again, we don't know why they're more unsure about it, but they're more unsure about that. But then, it's in essence, it's kind of a way to hedge their positive decisions by writing tougher reports, in a sense. And again, our principal assumption is going to be referee assignment across author gender is basically referee assignment is orthogonal, is across both author gender and experience, or at least experience, the way it differs by author gender evolves similarly across experience. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you. Marlene Coffey from Toronto, University of Toronto, please.
Hi, everyone. Green, okay. Thank you very much to the organizer for having me discussing this very interesting paper. So just a quick summary. This is a really great paper that I really enjoy reading, and I really do because I have a lot of comments. So either it's a proof of my lack of experience in discussing, or either I get very excited about the paper. So just a quick summary. This paper combines administrative data from energy economics. This is kind of a top field journal in economics, with barometric data on the author and also on the article. So as Erin said, we have like around 2,300 articles, with approximately 50% of them being a female author. So there are a couple of takeaways. So the three, yes, pretty much. So the reviewers spend more time reviewing female papers, yes. Do women spend more time reviewing their paper? Yes. And does referee experience also matter? This is also a yes. So finally, we have a big result, like it will take 3 to 4 weeks longer to female to review their paper. So the author did really a great job in discussing the different mechanisms. So what I will present here is more like some alternative story that we can think about and eventually test to rule out the key mechanism in the paper. So the suggestion that will be around 4 main points: empirical strategy, the statistical discrimination story, and some other findings in the paper. So the first thing regarding the empirical strategy, so the one thing is the measure of experience in the paper. So pretty much experience is measured as the number of accepted paper a referee previously reviewed for energy economics. So I was a bit wondering, like, to which extent this restriction could be related to the leniency of the referee more than the experience of the referee, pretty much, because of this accepted paper part. So I will suggest a broad measure using the total number of papers that have been reviewed by this referee. The second point is regarding the control. I think it could be interesting to have, maybe I missed this, to have a control on the number of referee per paper, because this could be, I mean, first of all, we can have maybe a difference in terms of referee assignment, in terms of the number of referee assigned by gender, and eventually this difference could be explained again by a couple of factors that could be discriminatory, but also non-discriminatory. For example, there is a literature showing that gender diversity is correlated with an increase in the complexity or also the novelty or the performance of the paper. And Erin has also a paper talking about this, and a couple of other authors. And finally, if we have a substitution between the experience of the referee and also the number of the referee for a given paper. So this could be interesting also to look into. The second thing is regarding the statistical discrimination story. And the main thing that I pointed here is the gender of the referee. So pretty much, Card and co-authors have shown that editors are more likely to assign a female author paper to a female referee. So basically, the same reason that make the female delaying the revision could also make them delaying the referee report. So if we can think about family commitments, services, lacking of grant access, etc. So finally, all of those things could also delay the referee reports. And this is not in contradiction with the experience referee updating effect, because basically there is also literature showing that women penalty, either in terms of wage or in terms of publication, tend to narrow down as we move into the career ladder, or pretty much over the life cycle of the career. So we can imagine a story where those experienced referee that is also correlated to a certain extent to the life cycle, where you are in the life cycle, could improve allow you to have more time to review the paper and to have shorter time. So this is the main thing that I would suggest to check regarding the statistical discrimination story. There are a couple of findings, but I saw that those results had changed to the version the author presented, so I will skip this. But the second point is in the paper, the author didn't show it, but in the paper they show that we have a difference by affiliation rank. So pretty much you have an effect where when the affiliation rank increase, you can see a bigger gap in terms of the time to review the paper. So I was wondering if it is like a networking effect, a visibility effect, maybe men at those institutions are more visible than the female, that's why we observe this gap, or even it could still be a statistical discrimination story where women quality is more doubted when they are at top institution, because of many things that we can think about, maybe discussions surrounding affirmative action, women's quotas, etc. So finally, what happens if we interact like the author prominence with the affiliation? So this could give an answer potentially to the statistical discrimination story. The third point is more to open the debate. So pretty much, Erin has also a paper where she showed that women tend to spend more time in the reviewing process. At the same time, Card and co-author shows also that they do not find any gender delay in the reviewing process. So finally, how we can reconcile those different results? So is it the allocation of paper to referee that matter here? It could be due to the experience or not. So pretty much, what can we learn from those journals where we do not observe any gender gap in the reviewing process? And if there is something to learn from them. So yeah. And also, the question that I'm also asking myself to some extent is the level set for some journal less ambiguous than for others. So that's another point. Again, in opening the discussion, so the author gave an example of the Institute of Physics that delivers some peer review certificates. So pretty much enabling the author to know what are the levels that are set, what are the standards for a given journal that we have. But at the same time, journal ranking or the level of the journal, it looks a bit like a game, pretty much. And in this game, you want to be the top. It may take some time for others, not that much time, but you want to be the top. So if you set a clear standard, so how can you deal with the fact that at some point you would like to be above other journals? And the example that I show here, I show three journals. So we have Review of Economic Study and Review of Economic and Statistics and IEG Apply. And if you look at a bit carefully this plot, you will see that IEG Apply is catching up on Review of Economic Study to some extent, at least measuring using the log of impact factor. So pretty much if they have to set some standard before, isn't it a risk that at some point they won't reach this level? So it's a bit, what I want to emphasize is it's a bit a tricky policy implementation to have, and we should think about it much more. And I have had a suggestion. So one among those is to consider, instead of just the corresponding author, to consider the full gender category, I want to say, of the paper. So mixed gender team, all-female team. Sometimes we have some nuances between those different categories. And I understand that the corresponding author could be very important, but at the same time, the what we have in economics is a bit different by comparison to other science where the first or the last author matter. So it could be important to look at this. I have a couple of other comments. I think I am over time, and we could discuss this later. So this was a great paper that I really enjoy reading. And finally, we have you need 10 positive referee as an experience to reduce the gap by 1 day. So you can see that by comparison to the absolute value of the gap, this is still a lot. So we are not yet over understanding what happened with the gender gap in referring time. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Any question? Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. It was a really interesting presentation. Very interesting findings. I enjoyed the presentation a lot. So I thought it would be really nice to maybe tease out a little bit more what the problem is with female papers. And I think one potential idea would be to conduct some sort of lab experiment where you give people a part of the paper, maybe the introduction, without the name of the author, and check whether there is still this gender discrimination or whether it is maybe something, as you suggest, there is some sort of code or style of writing that is different for women than for men. So that's just a suggestion to have a treatment where the author gender is not known. Yeah, you want me?
Yeah, so there is actually a study that was done, I think, in maybe 2014 or 2015 that did almost exactly that. So basically, it took papers and it had students read them. They were economics papers and had without their name, and had students read them and then guess where they were published. And then the results of that suggest that the students tended to think that the papers would publish less well if they only saw a female authored name on it as opposed to a male authored name. So they basically took, if I remember correctly, they took basically papers that are written by a man and a woman, and then they just took out one of the names. So you just saw one of the names, whether it was written by a man or a woman, and they tended to think that those papers published less well when they were written by a woman versus when those same papers were written by a man. But there's also evidence, what I'm trying to say with that is I think it's probably both. There's also, however, a recent other study that was that actually surveyed, basically did that. So it took I think 18 or so abstracts and sent them to actual editors, and they didn't. So there was nothing. So we just asked the editors to actually evaluate the paper, and if anything, there was an advantage for women in that case, which would be consistent. In fact, at least when editors are looking at it, that it's something that's not specific to gender. So given those two results, I would imagine it's probably both that's going on.
Yeah. I mean, there you could also look at the time, how long they need, kind of, to make some sort of evaluation. Yeah. And maybe one second comment. So I sometimes hear that it takes more time to referee and review a really good paper. And perhaps that also results in the end in a yet better paper. So one could also look at, whether that is potentially the case, whether this longer review process results in a higher quality work.
In this particular paper, we don't see, so again, we kind of hit up on the thing about what is quality, and we don't see in energy economics a gender difference in the actual citations. But yes, absolutely, that could have, so that's we kind of think of our citations as potentially an upper lower bound, effectively, because of that potential bias written into it, because it's actually ex post, it's after the decision to review, and so it could have actually been influenced by the review itself, whereas the other decisions actually were so we kind of see that as an upper lower bound in a sense, because it could also be biased downward. But yeah, I think we would have to come up with a different measure of quality, but I will think about that. That's a good suggestion.
Very last question there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think not. I saw that you also got the gel codes of each one of the. Did you think a little bit also controlling for subfields on energy? Because you can think, I don't know, maybe clean energy demands more like effort than oil that's already more established, and for some reason there's a higher share of like either men or women working on those subtopics that would either increase or decrease the results?
So yes, so in the paper we do have secondary JEL codes, and so we control for those, and those as well as several other things don't really have much of an effect. So we don't see that. The only thing the only control variable we see that actually does seem to have an effect is institution fixed effects, and that seems to actually cause the gap to balloon a bit, and which we find to be very interesting. I didn't have time to talk about it, but basically Marlene kind of discussed it briefly, but we kind of think it might be just, it's exploratory. We think it might be actually evidence in that sense of institutions, perhaps, well, I'll talk about this later, but the important thing is that actually JEL fixed effects don't really have an impact.
Okay. Would you like to spend a couple of minutes answering to Marlene?
Yeah, so actually I think the big thing I wanted to say to Marlene was just, I think so yes, we should, we've gotten a couple times looking at, I don't think we can do a very robust analysis looking at the referee gender because, we've actually consolidated that. They're mostly guys. So this is a very male-dominated journal. So like the number of like female-authored papers that would be reviewed by actually female referees is very tiny. But we should definitely, I think, use that as a control variable because it could actually, like in the career stage, could actually go into it. So that's a great idea. But yeah.
Thank you to everyone. With this, we close the second session. Very interesting, very dense. And now Cesar is going to tell us about logistics.
Okay, so this concludes today's session. And for those of you joining us virtually, we'll be back tomorrow online at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. With a policy panel, and my colleague Sermon Gango will be the MC of tomorrow. So thank you once again to all our speakers, and also for a good discussion in the room, from the floor, from online. That was a great day for today.